It was supposed to be just another winter haul through the northern ridge, snow in the air, steam on the rails, and nothing but forest on either side. But when Daniel spotted the bear cub tangled near the tracks, he didn't think twice. A quick pull of the brake, a scramble down into the drift, and the little thing was free. The cub stared up at him, shivering but alive, before darting into the trees. By the time Daniel climbed back into the cab, he figured their paths had crossed for the first and last time. He was wrong. 2 miles later, past the bend where the river froze to glass, something moved along the treeline, a small shadow keeping pace with the train. The bear cub hadn't gone back to the wild. It was following. The locomotive groaned as it pulled against the grade, each wheel bite echoing off the snow-laden ridge. Daniel kept one gloved hand on the throttle, the other resting near the brake lever, eyes sweeping the track ahead the way he'd done for 30 winters. Most days, the job was just rhythm, steam, steel, and distance. But today, something in the corner of his vision snapped that rhythm in two. It was movement, small and erratic, just off the right-of-way where the pines thinned against the embankment. At first, he thought it was a fallen branch shifting in the wind. Then he saw the fur, a mottled brown shape flailing against a tangle of deadfall and frozen underbrush. By the time he realized it was a bear cub, he was already throwing the brake. The train shuddered, couplings groaning in protest, a cloud of steam rolling past the cab windows. Daniel climbed down the ladder into the bite of the wind. The snow was deep here, swallowing his boots almost to the knee. The cub's cries were small but sharp, the kind that cut through the sound of the idling engine. It thrashed when he got close, one hind leg twisted awkwardly under a branch that had fallen from a nearby pine. "Easy now," Daniel murmured, crouching low. His voice sounded strange in the quiet of the forest. The cub's eyes, dark, wide, locked on him. With gloved hands, he levered the branch just enough to free the leg. The cub scrambled backward, testing its weight before standing unsteadily. For a moment, they both stayed still, steam from the train and the cub's breath mingling in the cold. Then, without another sound, the little bear turned and padded into the trees. Daniel exhaled, brushing snow from his knees, and climbed back into the cab. The train eased forward again, iron wheels clanking against the frozen track. By the time they crossed the next trestle, the moment was already folding into the long line of things he'd seen but wouldn't likely speak of again. Then, 2 miles down the line, just before the curve where the river bent away, he caught sight of it in the trees, a small brown shadow keeping pace with the train. He leaned out the window, squinting into the low winter light. The cub was running. Not in panic. Not in aimless flight. But in deliberate pursuit, its little legs churning through the snow, always within sight of the train's edge. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. The tracks ahead ran for another 8 miles before the next station. A cub couldn't follow for that long. Could it? The train pushed on, steam hissing from the valves, but every time Daniel looked back toward the treeline, the cub was still there. Daniel kept glancing at the treeline, expecting to see the cub fall behind. The grade ahead was steep, the snow deep, and no wild creature, especially one that young, could keep pace with a locomotive for long. But every bend in the track proved him wrong. The cub was still there, its small body cutting a determined line through the snow, weaving between the trees as if it understood the rails well enough to avoid the open cuts and rock faces. Daniel had seen animals run from trains before, deer scattering at the sound, foxes darting into the brush. But this wasn't flight. This was a pursuit. He throttled back slightly, letting the engine's pace ease to a crawl without bringing it to a full stop. The couplings clinked softly between the freight cars. The crew in the rear wouldn't think twice about it. Winter runs often slowed for track checks or wildlife crossings. Leaning out the window, Daniel gave a sharp whistle, not the piercing blast of the locomotive, but a short, human note that cut through the cold air. The cub's head snapped toward him, ears forward, then it surged ahead for a few paces as if to answer. He could see it more clearly now. Its fur was a mottled mix of rich brown and lighter streaks down the neck, clumped with snow. One side of its face bore a faint scratch, likely from the fall that had trapped it earlier. Its paws sank deep into the drifts, but it didn't slow. "You're gonna wear yourself out, little one," Daniel muttered under his breath. He thought of pulling the brake again, climbing down, maybe coaxing it closer, but the rules on the line were strict, and he'd already bent them once. Wild animals belonged in the wild. Still, as the train rolled over a narrow trestle spanning a frozen creek, Daniel's gut told him the cub wasn't simply wandering. Bears this young didn't stray far from their mothers unless something had happened. If this one was alone out here, in the dead of winter, its chances were already slim. The tree line broke ahead, opening into a long stretch where the track ran beside the river. Daniel kept the throttle low, giving the cub the chance to cross the open ground without losing cover. To his surprise, it didn't falter in the open. If anything, it drew closer, the distance between them narrowing until he could see the whites of its eyes. By the time the station roofline came into view in the distance, Daniel knew one thing for certain: this wasn't a random encounter anymore. The cub had made a choice, and for reasons he couldn't yet understand, it had decided to follow him. The station at Coldwater Junction was little more than a weathered platform and a squat building with a potbelly stove inside. Freight trains didn't linger here in winter, just enough time to check the wheels, swap the mail sacks, and take on water before pushing north. Daniel eased the locomotive in, the steel wheels shrieking lightly as they gripped the iced rails. He scanned the tree line before the train rolled to a halt. At first, there was nothing but the shadow of the pines against the white drifts. Then, from behind a low berm of snow, the cub appeared, chest heaving, each step heavy now with exhaustion. It was moving slower, but its eyes stayed fixed on him. The platform crew noticed almost immediately. "Is that?" one of the younger men started, stepping toward the edge. "Bear cub," Daniel said simply, pulling off his gloves. He didn't add anything else. The fewer questions, the better. The cub stopped short of the platform, keeping to the shadow of the freight shed. It was close enough now that Daniel could see the tremor in its legs. Against the snow, it looked impossibly small, the tips of its fur crusted with ice. One of the station hands made to walk toward it, but Daniel shook his head. "Leave it. Spook it and it might bolt into the open track." The man hesitated, then backed away. Daniel stepped down from the cab, boots crunching on the packed snow. He kept his movements slow, non-threatening, the way he might approach a spooked dog. The cub didn't run. It just watched. From inside his coat pocket, Daniel pulled the heel of bread he'd saved from lunch. It wasn't much, but it was something. He crouched low and tossed the bread gently so it landed just a few feet from the cub. The little bear sniffed, then inched forward and took it, chewing in slow, deliberate bites. Daniel stayed there until the crew signaled it was time to roll. He rose, nodding once at the cub. "You've got to head back now," he murmured, though even as he said it, he didn't believe the bear would. By the time the locomotive pulled out, Daniel was back in the cab, watching the platform recede. For a few seconds, the cub stood where he'd left it, breadcrumbs in the snow. Then, as the last freight car cleared the platform, it began to follow again, limping slightly, but moving with the same stubborn will as before. The men on the crew muttered about it for a mile or two, then the talk faded. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He wasn't just a rescuer anymore. Like it or not, he was becoming the cub's anchor in a winter landscape that offered it nothing else. The rails north of Coldwater cut through some of the most unforgiving stretches Daniel knew, narrow rock cuts, frozen rivers, and bridges with nothing but open air on either side. In summer, the route was beautiful. In winter, it was lethal for anything caught between the trees and the track. Daniel kept glancing in the mirror bolted to the cab's side, but the curves made it hard to see far behind. Every time they passed a break in the forest, he searched for a flash of brown against the snow. For the first few miles, nothing. He told himself the cub had stayed behind, that maybe it had found the sense to give up. But then, as they rounded a bend where the rock face opened to a frozen meadow, he saw it, low to the ground, weaving through the drifts, still keeping pace. The next obstacle came sooner than he'd hoped, the iron water bridge, 100 feet of steel spanning the frozen river below. For a man, crossing it meant trusting the rails. For a small animal, it meant no cover, no grip, and a fall that would kill outright. Daniel's hands tightened on the throttle. He eased the engine down to a crawl, enough that the freight behind didn't bunch too hard, but it was still a dangerous stretch. He leaned out just in time to see the cub break from the trees onto the snow-packed service path alongside the bridge. The wind was sharper here, tearing at the cub's fur. It crouched for a moment, testing the strange, hollow clink of the frozen steel beneath its paws, then began to cross, each step deliberate, claws scraping faintly against the frost. Daniel's gut twisted. If the cub slipped, there was nothing he could do. He forced himself to keep the train moving, the low rumble vibrating through the metal under his boots. Halfway across, a gust hit, sending a spray of powder into the air. The cub hunched against it, head low, then pressed on. When the far side finally came into view, Daniel felt a tension in his shoulders he hadn't noticed release all at once. The cub reached the snow again, shaking itself out before darting for the cover of the pines. For a few moments, Daniel just let the train roll, the sound of the river under ice fading behind them. He knew now that this little bear wasn't just determined, it was learning, adapting to each new challenge the line threw at it. The thought was both heartening and troubling. Out here, intelligence wasn't always enough to survive. By the time they cleared the iron water bridge, the light had begun to thin into that pale, colorless wash that always came before dusk in the high country. The temperature dropped with it, the kind of cold that stiffened the rails and made the joints pop under the weight of the train. Daniel knew the cub would be slowing, if not from exhaustion, then from the biting wind that cut through every gap in the trees. The rules of the line said nothing about wild animals pacing a freight, but they did say plenty about maintaining schedule. Still, when Daniel glanced at the pocket watch hanging from its chain, he saw they had just enough slack to bleed a few minutes without drawing questions from the dispatcher. He eased the throttle back another notch. The engine's rhythm softened, the couplings clinking gently instead of snapping tight. Somewhere behind him, one of the brakemen would be frowning, wondering why the engineer was nursing the run like it was glass. The answer came a mile later. The tree line dipped toward the track, and in the dimming light Daniel caught sight of the cub again, head down, gait uneven, but still moving. Snow clung to its legs in heavy clumps. Every so often, it stumbled, catching itself with a quick paw before pushing forward again. Daniel reached into the small tin lunch box he kept under the console. There was a crust of bread left, along with a piece of smoked fish he'd planned to save for later. Without thinking twice, he set them on the cab's edge, ready for the next stop. The station at North Hollow was just a flag post and a siding for passing freights. As they rolled in, Daniel braked harder than usual, stopping near a low snowbank beside the track. Steam hissed around him as he climbed down, boots crunching in the frost. The cub emerged from the trees within seconds, drawn by the stillness. It paused, watching him, then took a slow step forward. Daniel didn't close the distance, he knew better than to crowd it, but he placed the bread and fish on the snow, backing away with his hands open. The cub hesitated only a moment before taking the food, tearing at the bread first, then the fish. Steam curled from its mouth with each bite. When it finished, it looked up at him, not the quick, wary glance of a wild animal, but something steadier, like recognition. Daniel felt the weight of that look as he climbed back into the cab. As the train pulled away, the cub followed once more, this time with renewed strength. He told himself it was just a kindness, a bit of food in a hard winter. But deep down, he knew he'd just made a choice. He was helping it now, actively, deliberately. And there was no going back from that. Nightfall in the northern ridge came like a shutter snapping closed. One moment the sky was a dim wash of grey-blue, the next it was black, the only light spilling from the train's headlamp and the faint glow of the cab's gauges. Out here, darkness was more than an absence of light, it was a presence, something that pressed in from every direction, muffling sound and swallowing distance. Daniel had never liked running the line after dusk in winter. The shadows on the snow played tricks on the eyes, and the cold deepened to the kind that ached in the bones. But tonight, the unease ran deeper. Every so often, in the narrow tunnel of the headlamp's reach, he thought he caught movement along the edge of the track. It wasn't until they passed a stand of dead pines, their trunks silvered with frost, that he saw it for certain, the cub, moving just inside the spill of light, paws leaving small, sharp tracks in the powder. Daniel's first thought was disbelief. How had it kept up through the falling dark? Then the worry set in. The predators out here didn't sleep when the sun went down, and a young bear was little more than an easy meal if it strayed too far from cover. Wolves hunted these valleys, and the sound of the train might mask their approach until it was too late. He eased the throttle down again, letting the engine's growl fade to a steady murmur. The snow along the track glinted like ground glass in the headlamp, the air thick with drifting powder. He kept one eye on the rails ahead, the other on that small shape pacing them. They wouldn't reach the next siding until after midnight, and there was no safe way to take the cub aboard, not without risking injury to the crew or the animal. So Daniel did the only thing he could. He adjusted the train's pace to match the cub's, keeping it in sight as much as possible. Hours seemed to stretch. The rhythm of the wheels against the rails became a low, steady drumbeat in the night. Once or twice, Daniel lost sight of the cub when the trees closed in, but each time it reappeared a moment later, as if it knew the danger of letting itself fall too far behind. The snow grew heavier, the flakes catching in the lamplight like sparks. Daniel found himself leaning out into the cold, scanning the edge of the forest until his cheeks burned. Finally, in a narrow cut between two hills, he saw the cub pause, looking toward him for a long moment before disappearing into the dark. For a few tense seconds, he thought it might not return. Then, as the train's beam caught the far end of the cut, there it was again, emerging from the shadow, breath misting in the cold, still keeping pace. Daniel realized then that this wasn't just instinct driving it forward. The cub was making a choice, mile after mile, in the black cold of the high ridge. And somewhere deep down, he knew he was making the same choice every time he slowed the train. The storm came in without warning. One moment, the night was clear enough to see the shadow of the ridge against the stars. The next, the wind roared through the trees, throwing walls of snow across the tracks so thick the headlamp barely cut 10 feet ahead. Daniel tightened his grip on the throttle. Snow like this could bury a cut or hide ice on a curve, and if he wasn't careful, the whole train could be in trouble. But even as the wind clawed at the cab and the whistle moaned in the gusts, his eyes kept darting to the edge of the track. The cub was still there. Barely visible now, just a shifting blur in the swirling white, but he knew its shape, the way its head stayed low, the rhythm of its gait. Each time the snow lifted enough for him to see, it was still running, ears flat, fur plastered with frost. The storm turned the forest into a howl. The pine boughs thrashed, shedding clumps of snow that thudded into the drifts. Daniel's mind kept circling back to the danger. If the cub lost sight of the train in this whiteout, it would be hopelessly lost. Worse, if it strayed too far into the wind's teeth, the cold could kill it in under an hour. He made the call. Pulling the whistle cord once, a short, low note, he brought the train down to a near crawl, the couplings sighing as the freight cars compressed behind them. He wasn't supposed to stop on this stretch, no shelter, no siding, but slowing might keep the cub close enough to follow. The cab door banged open and Ward, the brakeman, leaned in against the wind. "What the hell are you doing, Dan? We'll freeze out here." Wide out ahead, Daniel said simply, eyes still on the swirling dark beyond the glass. Better to ride it slow than plow into something blind. Ward swore under his breath and disappeared back down the walkway, boots clanging on the steel. Daniel leaned out again. The snow stung his face, but in a break between gusts, he caught sight of the cub climbing over a drift, eyes fixed on the moving wheels just ahead of it. It looked smaller than ever in the storm, like the winter itself could swallow it in a blink. Another half hour crawled by before the wind eased, just enough for the headlamp to punch a longer path through the dark. The cub was still there, though its movements were slower, heavier. Daniel knew they needed to reach shelter soon. The next siding was 5 miles ahead, tucked in a bend where an old maintenance shed stood. He coaxed the engine back up to speed, careful not to leave the cub too far behind. If it could survive this storm, it could survive almost anything. But the real test was still coming. The shed wasn't just shelter, it was the first place Daniel might be able to get it out of the cold for good. The siding at Pine Bend was nothing more than a narrow pull-off in the rails, used by maintenance crews in better weather. Tonight, it looked like salvation. The squat maintenance shed hunkered against the slope, its roof heavy with snow, a drift piled nearly halfway up the door. Daniel eased the locomotive onto the siding, the couplings clinking softly as the freight cars rolled to a stop. Steam hissed from the valves, curling in the dim light of the headlamp. He climbed down without a word to the crew, his boots sinking deep into the powder. The cub appeared moments later, a small shadow breaking from the tree line. It moved slower now, legs stiff from the cold, fur heavy with ice. Each step looked like an effort. Daniel's chest tightened. He'd seen enough winters here to know the line between survival and collapse was thin, and the cub was straddling it. He trudged to the shed, pushing his shoulder against the door until it groaned open. Inside, the air was still cold, but it cut the wind. Old tools hung from the walls, and a rusted potbelly stove squatted in the corner, unused for seasons. A pile of firewood lay under a tarp, miraculously dry. Daniel turned back toward the cub. It stood at the edge of the lamplight spilling from the cab, head tilted, unsure. He crouched low, speaking softly over the wind. "Come on, little one. Just for the night." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the cub took a slow step forward, then another, its paws dragging in the snow. It crossed the gap between them and paused just inside the doorway, sniffing the air. Daniel stepped aside, letting it choose. Finally, it padded in, collapsing near the far wall with a sigh that steamed in the cold. He worked quickly, stacking wood in the stove and striking a match. The flame caught, growing into a crackle that filled the silence. As warmth began to seep into the shed, the cub's breathing slowed. Its eyes half closed, though it never looked away from him entirely. Daniel sat on an overturned crate, stretching his hands toward the stove. Outside, the wind still screamed through the trees, battering the walls with snow. But in here, for the first time all night, there was calm. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether the cub would vanish back into the forest or follow the train again, but tonight, he'd made a promise, unspoken but binding. He'd seen it through the worst stretch of the ridge, and he wasn't about to stop now. The next stretch of track wound north along the edge of the river, its frozen surface glittering under the pale sun. Daniel kept the pace steady, glancing often at the snowbank beside the rails. The cub stayed with them, its gait easier now in daylight, paws sinking into the fresh powder with each step. Word had started to spread among the crew. A few of the men leaned out from the freight cars when they could, catching sight of the unlikely shadow pacing the train. They didn't call out or try to approach. Maybe they sensed that this was something fragile, something that could be ruined by too much human noise. By midday, the rails rose toward the ridgeline, climbing into country where the snow lay deeper and the wind funneled between the hills. Daniel thought about the weeks ahead. The run would take them to the last outpost before the pass, where the weather could lock in for months. If the cub was still with them by then, it wouldn't be safe to keep letting it trail in the cold. When they stopped at a small junction to take on water, Daniel stepped down, scanning the bank until he spotted it, standing just at the edge of the pine shade, watching him with those same steady eyes. He crouched, reaching into the pocket of his coat. This time, he had something better than bread or fish, a small piece of jerky from the crew's provisions. He tossed it gently, and the cub padded forward to take it, chewing slowly as steam from the locomotive drifted between them. Up close, Daniel saw the fullness in its face now, the spark of alertness back in its movements. This wasn't the half-frozen shadow he'd first seen on the ridge. When the jerky was gone, the cub stayed where it was, sitting back on its haunches. Daniel felt the moment hanging there, like they'd both reached a crossing. He could walk away now, let it fade back into the trees, and the wild would take its course. But instead, he spoke softly. "All right. You want to come with me, we'll figure it out." He turned toward the cab, not looking back until he was on the steps. The cub had risen, moving along the bank in time with the train as it started to roll. There was no hesitation now, no testing of the distance. As the rails curved north, the river opened wide below, sunlight flashing off the ice. The cub stayed in sight, mile after mile, its shadow stretching long on the snow beside the moving cars. Daniel didn't know how far this journey would take them, or what it might cost him in the eyes of the railway. But in that moment, he knew one thing: neither of them was going to walk away. The next stretch of track wound north along the edge of the river, its frozen surface glittering under the pale sun. Daniel kept the pace steady, glancing often at the snowbank beside the rails. The cub stayed with them, its gait easier now in daylight, paws sinking into the fresh powder with each step. Word had started to spread among the crew. A few of the men leaned out from the freight cars when they could, catching sight of the unlikely shadow pacing the train. They didn't call out or try to approach. Maybe they sensed that this was something fragile, something that could be ruined by too much human noise. By midday, the rails rose toward the ridgeline, climbing into country where the snow lay deeper and the wind funneled between the hills. Daniel thought about the weeks ahead. The run would take them to the last outpost before the pass, where the weather could lock in for months. If the cub was still with them by then, it wouldn't be safe to keep letting it trail in the cold. When they stopped at a small junction to take on water, Daniel stepped down, scanning the bank until he spotted it, standing just at the edge of the pine shade, watching him with those same steady eyes. He crouched, reaching into the pocket of his coat. This time, he had something better than bread or fish, a small piece of jerky from the crew's provisions. He tossed it gently, and the cub padded forward to take it, chewing slowly as steam from the locomotive drifted between them. Up close, Daniel saw the fullness in its face now, the spark of alertness back in its movements. This wasn't the half-frozen shadow he'd first seen on the ridge. When the jerky was gone, the cub stayed where it was, sitting back on its haunches. Daniel felt the moment hanging there, like they'd both reached a crossing. He could walk away now, let it fade back into the trees, and the wild would take its course. But instead, he spoke softly. "All right. You want to come with me, we'll figure it out." He turned toward the cab, not looking back until he was on the steps. The cub had risen, moving along the bank in time with the train as it started to roll. There was no hesitation now, no testing of the distance. As the rails curved north, the river opened wide below, sunlight flashing off the ice. The cub stayed in sight, mile after mile, its shadow stretching long on the snow beside the moving cars. Daniel didn't know how far this journey would take them, or what it might cost him in the eyes of the railway. But in that moment, he knew one thing: neither of them was going to walk away.